Editing human genomes. Scientists gather in Geneva to better regulate research on this controversial issue. But how will officials enforce rules around our DNA? And what are the risks of advanced research into human genetics? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem, Sika. Our genetic makeup has fascinated scientists and medical researchers for decades. There have been significant advances in the field of rewriting the blueprint of life or our DNA. It's been used to treat and prevent a number of disorders and diseases, but it could also be used to create what some have called designer babies. The medical world is divided over the approach. Last year, a scientist in China said he created the world's first genetically edited twins. It led to global condemnation. It is the first attempt at ushering the world into a future in which we can edit the very things that make us human. Scientists have gathered in Geneva this week to try to come up with some regulations. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, Mariana Hond explains how the science works.
Our DNA makes us unique. It determines our height, our eye colour, and the genetic disorders many of us are born with. Genetic editing offers us a way to fix those faulty genes, altering our somatic cells, the cells in our organs and tissues, in our skin and eyes. Genetic changes to these cells won't pass on to your children. The problem is when you genetically alter germline cells, the sperm, the egg, or in the case of the Chinese scientist, a fertilised egg at the single cell stage. Those genetic changes are passed on. We still don't know what the consequences could be. At this conference in November, Chinese scientist He Jiankui made an announcement that caused a collective gasp, the birth of the world's first genetically edited babies. He'd altered the CCR5 gene in twin baby girls while they were still in a petri dish to give them protection against HIV. He said he knew he was crossing an ethical line, but he did it anyway.
There will be someone somewhere who's doing this. If it's not me, it's someone else.
The scientific world responded with condemnation.
No babies should be born at this point in time following the use of this technology. It's simply too early, too premature.
It's a fantastic technology if it's applied to the right application. So for somatic cell editing, that's editing cells that are adult cells from a fully consenting adult, fantastic technology, and I'm sure we're going to see it progressing into the clinic. But what he did was take this amazing technology and apply it incorrectly.
Gene editing trials involve consenting adults, but the twin girls known as Lulu and Nana weren't given a choice. The changes to their genes are likely permanent and with consequences unknown.
The technology that they used is extremely error-prone, and it utilises genetic modification pathways within the cells that pretty much are very hard to control, and particularly have been known to cause mutations elsewhere in the genome.
Dr. He used the CRISPR-Cas9 technology not to correct, but to genetically enhance. It raises the spectre of scientists creating so-called designer babies in the lab to potentially make them stronger, faster, smarter even. Many scientists are pushing for clear and transparent guidelines, even advocating a pause until countries can agree on how to meet the challenges of germline editing. A panel of scientists assembled by the World Health Organization is now working on a way forward. Mariana Hond, Al Jazeera.
All right, well, let's bring in our panel now. In Singapore, we have biomedical ethicist Owen Schaefer, who is an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. In Boston, Sharon Begley, a senior science writer at STAT, a health-focused news website owned by the Boston Globe. And in London, Helen O'Neill, lecturer in reproductive and molecular genetics at University College London, who researches genome editing as a potential treatment of disorders. Welcome, all of you. So, Helen, if I could start with you then, why did this happen? Does this event show that we may perhaps be going on a slippery slope here? Is it too early to be going into this sort of field?
It's certainly too early to go into this field. Why this happened is down to, I think, probably one person's hubris and their own motives to advance themselves. I don't think it reflects the rest of the scientific community for their motives or the globe, in fact. The way the globe reacted was perfectly resounding of how the rest of us feel about it, that it was a premature adoption.
Owen, Schaefer, is it acceptable to edit the human genome?
That's a big question. I don't know, who am I to say? I'm just one ethicist. I think the most important thing that everyone has been emphasizing now is we need to have a public dialogue on that very question, on whether or not we think it's acceptable to alter our genomics, to alter the DNA that affects so many of our traits. And yeah, I think if this unethical experiment by He Jiankui can have any silver lining, is that it prompts us, it forces us to have a societal debate over these very thorny questions.
Sharon Begley, what's the general public's what's public opinion say about all of this? I mean, do the criticisms of Dr. He in China and his team reflect public opinion at large?
I think the public is very confused about what this technology can be used for and what it can appropriately be used for. There have been a number of public polls in the United States as well as elsewhere, and the general response to those polls is, if the question is posed, if you could save a child from having a severe, even deadly disease, and do so before that child is born, would you? When it's posed like that, a large fraction of the public says, yes, it is ethical, it is desirable even to save that child. But then when you start drilling down and use phrases like designer babies, and whether this technology is available only to the very, very rich, will it create a society of genetic haves and have-not, then not surprisingly, the public opinion veers toward no, this should not be done.
Yeah, Helen O'Neill, I mean, Sharon brings up a good point there about the designer babies. This is the phrase that really kind of pushes people's buttons when you get into this subject, is the fear that this could be taken to extremes so that we could have a society where that sort of happens. I mean, I know it conjures up sort of dystopian visions of the future and so on, but is it a legitimate concern?
I don't think it's a legitimate phrase at all. I think it insults the technology, it insults the would-be patients. When you look at the two scenarios that were just presented, one of them is quite factual. It said, would you prevent a genetic disorder in a child if they were going to be born with it? Yes, people agreed that would be a viable use for the technology. The other scenario that was presented was to say, would you allow designer babies? Can you define a designer baby? We design our babies every time we choose a partner. So it's an unfair use of a term that is incorrectly defining something that actually does not shed any light on the situation. By calling it designer babies, it really insults the technology and would-be patients that would be very actually wanting and willing to do this to prevent serious heritable illnesses in children.
But you would be in favour of further research and further efforts of genetic editing that would improve people's health prospects.
Absolutely. I think further research is top of the list, not just in terms of skipping to the clinic or skipping to health benefits. The major benefit that we will see from doing germline genome editing and the research in that is to understand more about the earliest forms of human development, which at the moment we know surprisingly little about.
Owen, Schaefer, we mentioned there that the World Health Organization is going to get together with lots of people whose business it is to know this kind of stuff and come up with some guidelines, some boundaries, perhaps, on how this research should be done going forward. Is it going to make any difference, do you think, particularly when there's no real sort of enforcement mechanisms?
Well, that's a difficult question. Yeah, the WHO has a certain amount of clout. Now, they don't necessarily have direct legal enforcement across various nations, but if they produce guidelines, it is very possible that their recommendations will carry a good amount of weight in individual countries. But ultimately, it looks highly unlikely there will be any international treaty on this. So it's probably going to be up to individual countries to decide, once the WHO releases its own recommendations, how to adapt that to their own particular values, their own particular norms, and their own perspectives on what kind of society they want to live in.
Sharon Begley, how should the medical community or people involved in this sort of thing be engaging with the public to inform them more about the pros and cons of all of this?
Well, certainly programs like this make a step in that direction. But I think there's an assumption here that the medical and scientific community is monolithic in some way on this topic. And just last week, we saw that it wasn't. 18 scientists from more than half a dozen countries called for a blanket moratorium on CRISPR germline editing for reproductive uses. But a number of scientists who, in fact, led the development of CRISPR were absent from the list of people calling for a moratorium. So just a few months after Dr. He's announcement, the expert community cannot agree on whether there should be a blanket prohibition on this or whether there should be a more sort of case-by-case decision-making. And the argument for the latter is, if there is a blanket prohibition, if there is a moratorium, either worldwide or country by country, and just to insert there, more than 30 countries already outlaw germline editing. But if there were a global moratorium, the concern is that it would be very hard to undo that. And a number of scientists, despite the condemnation of Dr. He, do think that eventually we should not only allow, but perhaps embrace germline editing. So the idea that this is an outrageous possibility in the eyes of the entire medical scientific community is simply incorrect.
Helen O'Neill, where do you draw the line here on what's acceptable and what isn't? I mean, how do we make the judgment over whether the risk is right or not, and who makes that judgment?
I don't think that's up to any one person to make. It has to be a collaborative effort to come up with where the line is drawn. And yet, in our moral stances, we know that the line is very clear between enhancement and medical treatment, where that line gets very much blurred, even though everyone agrees that enhancement, it would be beyond that line. Where the line gets blurred is where genes are not fully understood. And actually the perfect example of that is the gene which He Jiankui tried to mutate. I say tried because he was not necessarily successful in both twins. And that gene, though the mutation he attempted to create would prevent them having contracting HIV, it also served other roles, such as enhanced neurocognitive ability in individuals with the same mutation. So it's that blurs the line between whether we can make a distinction or whether the distinction gets made for us through learning and through understanding our biology.
Owen, Schaefer, what's your take on this? I mean, would strengthening regulations necessarily be an effective solution to avoid the rogue behavior like what we saw with Dr. He in China? And one was reminded of the comment that he made. He said, if it wasn't me, it's going to be somebody else.
Yeah, well, it's tough. I mean, you have an international community, you have a technology that the basic science of it is widely available in publications that almost anyone is able to access. CRISPR is such a powerful technology because it is relatively straightforward to deploy and utilize. So yeah, you could have a country like China could tighten its regulations to make sure there's not another He Jiankui. But what about in other countries we're not even thinking about right now, where there are scientists that are thinking about engaging in this practice? It's going to be extremely difficult to absolutely prevent such rogues from occurring. That having been said, I think that by having tight regulations in the countries that are leaders in this field, countries where the basic science is being performed, and China was one of those countries that was a pioneer in the basic science, for those countries to have tight regulations to really clamp down on rogue scientists like He Jiankui, I think that's going to go a long way towards minimizing the risk of future unethical experiments. But you can never fully eliminate that risk. The technology, its basic understanding of it, that's widely available, and the genie is out of the bottle.
How would you clamp down on the rogue scientists, though? I mean, there's no international governing body that enforces bioethics rules at the moment. I mean, does it come down to, if somebody breaks the rules, the scientific community can just sort of ostracize them, refuse to publish their findings, that sort of thing?
Well, one would hope that individual countries that have the capability to do this sort of experimentation would also have the laws and the regulations to enforce, to sanction those that would engage in these activities. In countries that lack such laws, I think that the scientific community has an obligation to stand up, as they did with He Jiankui, to condemn, to ostracize. But it becomes difficult. You might say, oh, they shouldn't publish any of these sort of results. But by saying you shouldn't publish, then we won't be able to know what exactly the effects of these experiments were. So it behooves the scientific community to find out what those baby twins girls' genetic profiles are like, so we can evaluate the effectiveness of an unethical experiment. And that's a difficult conundrum, because then if the article does get published, it kind of rewards the scientist that did it. But I do think that, condemnation is absolutely essential in these cases.
Sharon Begley, as we mentioned earlier, the World Health Organization, as it gets together brings people together to come up with these sort of guidelines. As far as we know, people like sociologists, patient advocates, historians, and so on, are not going to be represented. And neither are policymakers in these meetings. Have they missed something there? Because these are people who can understand some of the big social questions that are inherent in genome editing. And as a journalist yourself who covers this field, is that something that the WHO would benefit from?
It certainly would benefit from that input, and the lack of representation on the part of patient representatives, the disabled community, and many others has been a problem for the International Genome Summit since the first one was held in 2015. That was in Washington. The one in Hong Kong last November was the second. And at both of those, there was very little input from anyone other than scientists and to some extent policymakers. But it's important to point out, I think, that Dr. He did not consider himself a rogue scientist. He believed that he was adhering to Chinese law. He also believed that he was adhering to the guidelines issued by the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, the Nuffield Council in England, and other national bodies that had weighed in on the ethics and science of germline editing. He believed that he had checked all the boxes, according to friends of his that I've spoken to. He believed that he was doing something that was safe. He believed that he had consent from the parents, and he believed that the gene that he was going after could be targeted safely, and that doing so addressed a severe unmet medical need. So as you think about all of those phrases, safe, severe medical need, those are all highly subjective. So, I think what the WHO Expert Advisory Committee will very likely be looking at is whether anything other than I keep using the phrase, a blanket prohibition, a blanket moratorium is going to be effective, because anything short of that, some scientist somewhere is going to believe that he or she has met the guidelines to go ahead with germline editing.
Helen O'Neill, what's your take on this idea of a blanket moratorium then?
I really disagree with the idea of a blanket moratorium. I don't think it serves to progress science. I don't think it serves to progress our understanding or to move forward. I think that legislation should not be made based on the actions of one individual. That is, at the end of the day, an exception. We don't make laws to prevent people from doing things based on individual crimes of one individual who does something. It doesn't mean that the rest of the scientific community should be punished. I think the reaction has been a great example of what will be done. I think that there will be sanctions put in place and have been put in place for Dr. He himself, but to try and prevent research happening by putting a moratorium is just not a progressive way forward for any form of technology.
And what do you make, Helen O'Neill, of what Dr. Hurd did? Do you think, as Sharon Begley has said, it's unfair to call him a rogue doctor, that he dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and so on, that he knew exactly what he was doing?
I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He was very aware that what he was doing was not right, that he was not within ethical principles or moral principles. Then again, I think that context is critical, and international context is also very important to remember, that different countries have different ideals for what is deemed acceptable and what is not acceptable. Whether or not he can be considered rogue in his own eyes, I think he's going to protect his own image, but there is no doubt that what he did on many, many levels was incorrect and wrong.
Owen, Schaefer, just looking at this going forward, I mean, how do countries go about sharing information that's gleaned from any new research? And is that the best way to make sure that that things don't go too far?
Well, I mean, sharing information, sharing the fruits of research, that's what facilitates both the generation of very important, very good scientific innovations, very beneficial scientific innovations. But the downside of that, of course, is that potentially malicious or ill-advised actors like He Jiankui could take that information and use it and apply it in ways that the people that share it don't really intend. There's been various proposals, though, to try to make sure that the people sharing the information maintain some degree of control. Some people have proposed the idea of using patents and patent controls to keep the person that generated the particular innovation, they can control how it's used. But I do think that the norm of open science, this idea that we should be sharing as widely and freely as possible to maximize the benefits to society, to realize the human right to benefit from science, I think that that is a very powerful force, and ultimately that norm is currently governing modern science, and I think that that there's no real way around that. We have to accept that data can and really should be shared widely. Sharon Begley, are the risks of any kind of unwanted or undetected errors acceptable? Should there be, I mean, is that something that the public should be more aware of when they make decisions, for example, to take part in trials like this?
So I think the press bears significant responsibility in not exactly correctly portraying CRISPR. It absolutely is a very powerful technology, but it's also very messy technology. As was pointed out earlier, the changes that Dr. He made in the single-cell embryos in what became the girls he calls Lulu and Nana, they were not the change that he wanted to make. It was just an unholy mess how he altered their DNA. And I don't think the public quite understands that. I think without a doubt that the parents who consented to this procedure did not understand it at all. The informed consent document did not make clear in any way what the risks might be. And we, in fact, still don't know what the risks might be to these little girls as they grow up. So I think both experts and the press have fallen down in the duty to explain what this technology could be, what the drawbacks are, and definitely what the potential for human good might be. But to say that the public is not terribly scientifically literate is an understatement, but you just have to work with that.
Fascinating topic. We could certainly spend a lot more time talking about it, but unfortunately we don't have any more. Thanks very much, all three of you, for being with us. Owen Schaefer, Sharon Begley, and Helen O'Neill. Thanks for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime. Just go to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation, as always, on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.